Okay, so the schedule for today's events. Sian's going to run us through the funding, what's changing. She's going to compare some old and new. She's going to look at providing apprenticeships, the new registers that you need to look out for, and the timeline of the changes as they happen. And then she's got a few links embedded in the slides where to find out more, where to find some useful summaries. Please do not worry, these slides will be posted on our website after the event. In fact, they will probably be live by tomorrow morning, and you will also be emailed a link to those. So please don't worry if you can't access them right now. And then we're going to conclude today with a brief interview with Anne Ashworth, who will give Pearson's point of view as an employer, as a levy payer. One other thing that I should also mention is there was an email that went out to you all yesterday with some pre-event material. If you didn't see that, or you haven't downloaded the PDF that was attached to it, you can download it from the materials tab on your screen at the moment. That is basically a summary of some of the more complex calculations that Sian's going to go through a bit later. So if you want to have a look at that while she's introducing and setting the scene, hopefully it'll be a little easier to digest that information when she gets to it. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over control of the screen to Sian.
Great, thanks, Neil.
Okay, Sian, your mic is now open. If you just share the presentation.
Okay. Thanks. Hopefully you're all seeing the presentation now. I'm going to start this by looking at what is changing in the funding landscape, because we know there are a number of changes coming together for the apprenticeships. One, you've got apprenticeship reform going on, which is all about the movement from frameworks to standards and what's going on there. You've also got the introduction of the levy, which is of course partly to do with funding, but it's another change in itself. And then you've got the actual funding and the funding methodology, which is the third change, and those are all being brought together all at the same time. So there's quite a lot of strands to the change here. So in terms of looking at the funding, and I will pick up on the levy as well, we're just trying to explain quite simply about what is changing and what is different for non-levy payers and levy payers, and also what is different for frameworks and standards, because sometimes they're going to be treated exactly the same and other times they're going to be treated very differently. So first of all, you've got the levy coming in, so you've got a difference between non-levy payers and levy payers, and that will impact on how the funding flows. So for non-levy payers, the funding flow will be the same for frameworks and standards. And for levy payers, the funding flow will be different for both frameworks and standards. Then you've got employer contributions, and of course that's different for levy payers, because for both frameworks and standards, the contribution from the employers will be 100%. And with non-levy payers, the way the funding will change means that both frameworks and standards will have exactly the same contribution from employers, unlike now where frameworks and standards are funded quite differently when it comes to employer government contribution. Then the additional payments, and once we have the new funding system in place, the additional payments will be exactly the same for both frameworks and standards, so we'll be moving over to a new model for both. And again, to say, unlike now, where the funding model is very different for frameworks to standards. Then from May, the rates will change as well. So levy payers and non-levy payers will see the funding rates for the apprenticeships being exactly the same, but the difference here is that DfE have assigned new rates to both frameworks and standards, and you can see that they're very different. And part of the reason for that is to encourage the move over to standards, and the other the other reason for that is that they recognise that standards might be more expensive to deliver. I think there's a lot of encouragement in there or incentive for people to move over to the new standards because the funding is higher, and we'll look at how you might want to compare that a bit later on, a bit further on in the presentation. So the levy, just to have a quick recap of the levy, there's a lot of information on this, and this presentation isn't focused on this, but just so we've got an overview. From April 2017, the levy will be introduced. As far as we know, this isn't going away, and it will be on the pay bill at a rate of 0.5%. So every single employer in the UK is subject to this, but of course the allowance means that most employers won't pay it. And because of there's allowance of £15,000 each tax year, it means that it's only payable on pay bills over £3 million. So essentially only 2% of employers in the UK will end up paying the levy. Excuse me. The allowance will operate on a monthly basis. So essentially all these figures will actually be added up monthly. So depending on your pay bill for that month, if you don't reach the allowance, then you won't have to pay. If you do reach the allowance, you'll pay what your balance on the allowance, and also there'll be a 10% top up from government on whatever you pay. So government are contributing to apprenticeships for levy payers, but it's done at the point of the levy. So they're not giving the employers the money in their pocket, they're giving the employers the money to spend on more apprenticeships or more expensive apprenticeships. So for example, if a levy liability for a large employer is in month 1 is £1,000, you don't pay the levy because you have an allowance of £1,200. You've got £250 left in your account, and that gets added to your allowance for next month, so your allowance is £1,500. And again, that will accumulate over time, so if you don't hit the allowance for next month, you don't pay it again. So it could be for those paying the levy and just hitting that number, it'll be quite a something to start looking at in terms of finance and accounting, to watch how when you go over the levy, then how much you're paying and then how much you have to spend. I think that would be the difficulty, people just touching that levy allowance and then having small amounts to spend. But that's something I think people are going to have to start actually watching, and actually the digital apprenticeship system service will help with that and show how these numbers will add up. What the DFE is saying is if people have unused allowance in a month but paid the levy previously in the tax year, they'll receive credit which employers can use to offset against other PAYE liabilities, and the credit will also reduce the amount of the levy paid. We don't have exact details on that at the moment, and we expect more details from the HMRC about how all this will work exactly in December. The levy applies to all employers across the UK, but because of the way that the policies have devolved, you will only be paid back the money that you pay to employers based on where they live. So if a lot of your employees live in Scotland, for example, you'll be paying levy on them, but you won't receive the money back for them, and that's because the money will also be going to Scotland and Wales, and the devolved nations will choose how they spend that money, and it's not in the same kind of levy system that we've got here. It won't be put directly back into apprenticeships as it is in here. The levy can be then spent on employees whose main workplace is England. So you'll be paying a levy. Employers will be paying the levy on everybody. They'll get the money back on those that live in the UK, and then they can spend that on apprentices that work in the UK, work in England. Any levy funds in the account expire after 18 months. So if things aren't touched, it will go back to the DFE and probably be used to support the non-levy payer employers. And the government is considering at the moment allowing employers to transfer 10% of unused funds to employers in the supply chain or sector from 2018. And the reason for this is that a lot of large employers might not want to spend their levy on their own employees, but they want to spend it on employers they work with. And I think the DFE are quite keen for that to happen. I think the only reason that isn't happening yet is they're trying to figure out how to do it efficiently and in a way that's not open to fraud. So I think the intention is there. It's just a technicality as to how they get it and how they get it right. So to move on to how the funding will flow, so for both frameworks and standards, Non-levy payers, the funding will flow pretty much as it will now. So the employer contribution is paid to the provider according to agreed schedule, and the government contribution is paid via an SFA contract. Eventually, what the government wants to see is everybody that is involved in apprenticeships on the digital apprenticeship service, although they can't open that to anyone apart from levy paying employers yet, probably because it's not ready. So the idea is that all employers will use DAS to pay for training and assessment by 2018 at the earliest and 2020 at the latest. The way the funding will flow for levy payers is that the employer and the government contribution will go straight to what is called the digital apprenticeship service and paid by employer to the provider via this digital apprenticeship service. And it's a key change in how the funding flows. So the funding doesn't touch the training provider, the funding goes direct to the employer. So it's a mindset thing, so that the employer sees the money in their account. It's no longer a matter of a training provider saying to the employer that they've got funding to spend. It's the employer having the funding, so they can go out and look for how they spend it and how they invest it. So it's sitting in their account, it's available for them to spend. And that's a key change around apprenticeships at the moment, is putting the employer in control of the funding. And in the past, even though it was down to the employer to invest in apprenticeships or get involved in apprenticeships, so the employer was in charge, but now it's far more obvious about where the money is and who's controlling the money. And I think that's a big psychological change for employers, especially those that are who are paying the levy and they actually see that these are their funds that they've paid into there. For employer contributions for levy payers, it's quite straightforward. The employer will be paying 100% of the costs. The government tops this up by 10%, but that isn't the case that employers get that money back. It just means that they've got 10% more to spend on apprenticeships. So all of their levy money is going towards apprenticeships, and plus they get an additional 10% from the government. Once the levy is spent, the employer uses the same model as non-levy providers, so they have to go to the contribution model. And for non-levy providers, what will happen is employers co-invest 10% and government co-invest 90%. Now, this is mandatory, so unless the 10% co-investment comes from the employer, the government won't co-invest their 90%. So that is very different to frameworks where the co-investment was it was 50%, so a lot larger co-investment from the employers. But it wasn't mandatory, so a lot of employers might not pay or might pay less than the 50%. It's also very different to the standards model where the co-investment is mandatory, but it's sat at 33% for employers. So it's a far more generous contribution from government at 90%, but it is mandatory. So swings and roundabouts, it has to be invested, but the investment model is much lower. The investment percentage is much lower. There's no funding reduction for apprenticeships age 24 plus, which there is currently in the frameworks funding model. And the funding band that is set for all apprenticeship standards and apprenticeship frameworks from May 2017 is the absolute maximum that the government will co-invest towards. So say the band is £5,000, that's the maximum the training provider will receive, but £500 of that will come from the employer and £4,500 will come from the government. If I've got my percentages right, yes. Small employers, or those who employ less than 50, don't have to co-invest. The government pays 100%, and of course this is recognising the difficulty that really small employers might have in setting up apprenticeships, supporting them generally, because there's costs around there, so they don't have to contribute towards the cost of the actual training at all. So that's just a quick summary of how the contributions will work. Now, additional payments. There's as well as those very simple. It's a very simple model when it comes to the contributions: the 10%, 90%, or the 100% when it comes to the levy. On top of that, for both levy and non-levy payers, you've got additional payments to make sure that those where the costs will definitely be higher, the government are contributing. So for 16 to 18-year-olds, £1,000 will go to the employer and £1,000 will go to the provider. So that's on top of any funding band that you're looking at. Those payments are made, and £1,000 will go to the employer. It doesn't have to be spent on the apprenticeships. £1,000 will go to the provider and to go towards the cost of the training. They'll also help with the 19 to 24-year-old care leavers or those with a local authority education and healthcare plan. And the same costs for those. £1,000 goes to the employer and £1,000 goes to the provider. Now, the questions that have been asked around here, which I think have been in the press quite recently, is £1,000 enough to cover the costs of what might be needed for 16 to 18-year-olds? Because especially under frameworks are 100% funded by government in the current frameworks model. So there's a lot of questions around whether that money is enough to ensure that employers continue to take on 16 to 18-year-old apprenticeships. And I think that debate will go on for a long time, but I think it will be down to the employers and the providers to look at what they need, what they can afford, what the additional costs are, and looking at whether the funding can cover that. I don't think we can answer it as a yes or no question here. On top of that, there's a flat rate for English and Maths, which goes directly from the government straight to the provider to make sure that the English and Maths is covered, because of course anybody doing an apprenticeship who needs English and Maths are funded to take it. And also for those with the learning difficulties, £150 per month can be claimed, and that's the same model as is now. There's no area uplifts or disadvantage funding, and this is something that happened in frameworks. If you're in a particular area, or if you if the learner came from a particular postcode, that would be added as part of the funding formula. Those are all gone. There's a really very simple funding model in the new system. It's just the funding bands and then the additional payments. So you often get you can maybe sacrifice a little bit of complexity around what particular learners you're teaching, what particular learners that are taking on apprenticeships, but the simplicity is there for this. So you could at least say this is exactly what I'm getting for this learner, so rather than adding up qualifications and timesing it by area uplifts. Funding rates. When we moved to the new funding regime from May 2017, every single apprenticeship standard and every single apprenticeship framework will be put onto a new funding band. So at the moment, if you're delivering apprenticeship frameworks, you'll be adding up all your qualifications in the framework and coming to your funding rate, and your standard will be you'll have a rate for your standard as well. What you need to watch out for in May 2017 is that all of those will change. So for every framework you're delivering, it has a new band assigned to it, and for every standard you're delivering, it will have a new band assigned to it. So all apprenticeships have been allocated into one of 15 funding bands, and those range from £1,500 to 27 grand. The upper limit of each caps the maximum amount of digital funds an employer who pays the levy can use towards an individual apprenticeship. So if you're paying the levy, you can't spend more. You can't spend more of your levy on the learner than the cap, than the band. Sorry, and it's also the maximum price the government will co-invest towards. So if it's £5,000, for example, that's how much the government will pay 90% towards. If you want to pay more than that, you can, but it has to. An employer can pay more than that if they want to, but that would have to come completely from the employer purse. The government won't co-invest anymore. It's also the cap. If you have insufficient digital funds and you can't use your levy, then you'd move on to this model, and that's the cap there as well. So it's the absolute maximum that can be spent or can be co-invested towards. So the way that the DfE have allocated these bands is different for frameworks and standards. And the reason for this, as we said at the beginning, is one, to recognise the standards are probably more costly to deliver, but two, to encourage people to move over to the standards because of the higher funding. So for frameworks, they've taken individual framework pathways, not just whole frameworks, but they've actually looked at the pathway within each framework, allocated it to the nearest funding band based on the current rate of government funding for adult apprenticeships. And that's quite crucial, because the government funding for adult apprenticeships is obviously quite different to the government funding for 16 to 18 apprenticeships. It's 50%. So that's how they've allocated it. That's how they've allocated the band frameworks. For STEM framework pathways, what they propose to do is to increase the current government-funded adult rate by 40% at level 2 and 80% at level 3, and that is to recognise that these are crucial areas and make sure that they don't go underfunded whilst people make the move from frameworks to standards. And then they've allocated that, whatever that figure is, they've allocated that to the nearest funding band. Now, with the standards, what they've done is allocated to a new funding band according to principles. So they've taken the lower cost standards, allocated the funding band that most closely aligns with the current funding band the standard is assigned to. So essentially, they've just looked at the standards and tried to put them onto the nearest funding band. And any that are at the top of the old caps, because of course the old caps, there are far fewer of them. There are 15 bands, so there's a lot more of a range. So if they're in the biggest range, they've tried to allocate them into a new band within the range, looking at the costs. And what they've done is make sure that they have looked at any cost evidence that they have and try to assign them to the right costs. And again, we've just repeated there that the new system will recognise standards are more expensive to deliver. And essentially, if you come to look at the new bands for both frameworks and standards, you'll see that standards, where they're comparable, framework and standard, the standard will be generally allocated at a higher funding rate.
Thanks, it's Gary. I'll give Sian a moment to take a breath. I did have one question that might be worth just clarifying, Sian, which is around the monies for maths and English going to providers.
Yeah.
Is that through existing channels such as an ILR, etc., or will that eventually go through some like the digital apprenticeship service?
I think for levy payers, I don't know the exact answer to that, but I think for levy payers it will go through DAS, and for non-levy payers it will go through, like you say, the existing channels, and then eventually once everybody's on DAS, because the idea is that eventually everybody will go through the DAS system. All apprenticeship fundings will go through the DAS system. So, but for the moment, yeah, I think it will just go through those two different channels.
So thank you for taking us through the kind of high-level detail funding rates. Lots changing there, lots to get our heads around, particularly in the transition from frameworks to standards for existing providers that are used to delivering frameworks and will have to transit across. So I know now that you're going to take us through how to compare old and new funding rates as some examples, really, which links to the materials that were sent previously.
Okay, what we've...
Sorry, Sian, can I just interrupt you there, because we have had a couple of people who've had some issues with the sound during the session that you were just doing. Can I ask, rather than reclaim control of the presentation from Sian and launch a poll, can I just ask, if you're having issues with sound, can you use the raise hand icon now? I'm just going to give you 30 seconds to do that. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, I'm going to put all of your hands down. Is that an issue of sound that you cannot hear anything, or you're getting echoes? If it's that you can't hear anything, can you raise your hand now? Well, obviously you won't be able to hear that. Okay, so Joy couldn't hear anything. Is it echoes? Raise your hand now if it's echoes. Echoes. Sound is blurred. Okay, all right. I can see a couple of reasons why some of you may be experiencing issues. There's a couple of you who appear to have used the same link to enter twice. So it's possible you've got a colleague who's in the same room as you. Can I suggest that that often causes severe and insurmountable issues that we can't deal with at this end. So I'm going to, where I see a duplicate, I'm going to eject one of you, and on the grounds that that will free up the other one. So if your colleague is in the same room, perhaps you could share that computer. So I'm going to eject you. Right, I do apologise to the person I've just ejected, but hopefully that will make your colleague a little easier to sound. All right, for those of you who are continuing to experience problems, can I suggest that the old IT help desk trick is actually quite effective in this regard, and if you do exit and come back in, you may well find that your sound improves. I managed to cure a few people's issues in that way. Okay. All right. Okay, so sorry for the interruption to the flow of the event, but I just thought it was important that we dealt with those issues for those colleagues who were having some trouble. I'm going to open up your mic again, Sian.
Thanks, Neil.
And also for...
Okay, we're going to talk a bit now about comparing old and new funding rates, and if you've opened the pre-presentation material, you'll probably be gasping in horror at it. But what I've tried to do here is give an example of how, if you wanted to, as a provider, look at what you were offering, look at the funding you were receiving for your framework or standard, and compare it to the new. And of course, this gets very complicated because frameworks and standards can depend on what kind of employer you are, the age of your learners, and whether you were successful, all the bits that made up the old funding methodology. So what I did there was just to try and give you a template to use if you really wanted to get to the nitty-gritty of what you will be receiving as a training provider, what you would be expecting from the employer to pay, and what the government would be contributing. So hopefully, if you want to actually use that, it will be a bit more simple because you can just knock out anything that doesn't apply to you. But it just gives you an idea of the it's just the basic arithmetic really of what you'd be looking at to say this is what we'd be getting for this learner this year. Come May, if we stick to the framework, this is the funding we'll be receiving, and come May, if we stick to if we move to the standard, this is what we'll be receiving. Because the main comparisons really you'll be using is if you're on a framework now, you want to know what funding you will receive on that framework come May, and you'll also probably want to say, okay, if we move to the standard come May, would we be better off? And I know it's not simple. That's not a simple funding calculation, because you've also got a lot of other things to take into consideration if you're moving, but at least you'll have the funding bit of that answered if you look at these comparisons. Now, there'll be a lot of providers out there that don't need to do this because they're new to them. They'll be new to standards come May, and there'll be a lot of providers that might not want to look at the funding and might just say, okay, we'll start afresh, we're delivering a new standard come May, so actually we'll just work with the funding we've got. But if you are interested in saying, okay, this is what we're receiving now, this is what we expect come the new funding methodology in May, it's just an idea about how to do it. So the differences between the two funding methodologies, you've got a basic funding rate, and at the moment you've got a basic funding rate for frameworks, which is not that basic because you've got to add up all the different qualifications that you're taking under the framework. Your basic funding rate at the moment for standards is what they call the funding cap, and you'd have to look at that funding cap and see what you're drawing down. And then your basic funding rate for both frameworks and standards come May will be the funding band for whichever standard or framework you're delivering. And these are available on the Skills Funding Agency website. They've assigned all these bands for May 2017. You'd also need to think about whether you're delivering to 16 to 18-year-olds or 19 to 23-year-olds and 24-plus-year-olds, because within frameworks that will have an impact on the employer contributions that are being made and on the government contributions. And also 16 to 18 and will of course attract those extra additional rates when it comes to the new funding in May. Small and large employers attract different kinds of rates, and that is the same now. That will apply in May as well as it does now. Achievement and successful completion it's different in the frameworks models now, it's different in the standards models now, and that will be different again in May. So thinking about what funding you would have attracted for that and what you will attract for it come May. Negotiation is a big difference. So in frameworks there doesn't tend to be negotiation. The government will pay 50% when it comes to 19+-year-olds. Sometimes the employer will contribute to that, sometimes they won't, but many providers will offer that framework without actually expecting a government contribution or the employer contribution, or they'll understand that actually the employer's contribution in other ways. But when it comes to standards, the employer can negotiate the rate with the training provider. So even though the government cap or the government band is at a certain rate, it could be that the employer's negotiated with you. So these are maximum funding amounts. There was an area uplift with frameworks, and if that was creating a lot of funding for you, then you need to think about that when you move to standards. Again, with disadvantaged funding, that would be lost under standards. It was only there under frameworks. So again, if that was important to you as a provider, it's worth thinking about how things will change when the funding for the standards and funding for the standards from May, and also your English and maths for under the just seeing how much you would have how much funding you would have drawn down for English and Maths, and how that will change under the new system. So this is where it gets quite complicated, because we're talking about two different models before May, and then we're talking about two different models after May. So if you want to have a look at how to compare them, what you'd need to do is look at whether you are a small employer, as in -50, and then you look for the 16 to 18-year-olds, 19 to 23-year-olds, and 24+-year-olds under the current standard. And what you want to be looking at is what the employer will pay, what the government will pay, and then most importantly to a training provider, what the training provider will receive to deliver the learning. So that is a very simple template of what you've got in far more complexity in the pre-reading materials, the pre-webinar materials, and it's just to show you the kind of examples of the funding comparisons that you would want to make. And as I said before, what you'll be really wanting to look at is to say, if you're delivering the framework, what funding am I getting now, and what funding will I receive from May if I stick to the framework? And you'll probably then want to look at, if there is a standard available, what is the funding for the framework and what is the funding for the standard, and is it worth us as a training provider moving from the framework to the standard, or are we sticking to the framework until it gets withdrawn? So it's just that purely funding consideration. I know there's a lot of other considerations when it comes to delivery of apprenticeships, but it's just in terms of looking at the money you're drawing down. So an example of that being worked out is taking a standard for all other employees, as in what I've tried to do here is just say this isn't about small employees, this is about one example. The employer contribution there for 16 to 18, and I won't go through all of these because it will just be a very simple maths lesson here, and you've got more of this on the pre-webinar material, but the maximum cap for that at the moment is £9,000. Because they're a 16 to 18-year-old, the government will contribute £2,700, and let's assume that they are successful. Sorry, they'll get those extra payments for being 16 to 18-year-olds and being I'm just assuming that they are successful, so they get those extra payments. So essentially, the employer contribution would be £900 for that 16 to 18-year-olds on a current standard. The government contribution will be the cap of the government contribution plus the incentive payments that are currently there with the standards model, and so the total to the provider is £27,000. And we've replicated that again with the 19 to 23-year-olds, and 24+ is no different in the current standards model. The frameworks, it's slightly more complicated there because of the funding model, but essentially the qualifications in this particular example that we've had, which is level 3 aerospace manufacturing, come to £6,313, and for 19 to 23-year-olds, the government contributes 50% of that. So actually what the employer will receive is the minimum, what the training provider will receive is the minimum of £8,160, and a maximum, if the employer contributes the other 50%, of £16,000, 318. So the sums there, we're not going to talk them through because it will just get too complicated, but it's just an example of what you can do if you are looking to compare these, and if you want to talk them through with me, you can always get in touch, and I can show you how I've come to those. But I think you probably all have an MIS person who can show you how those figures have got to, and show you how you want to compare what kind of provider you are, what kind of learners you're dealing with, what kind of employers you're dealing with to get to those figures.
And Sian, can people use the template from today's slide, etc.? Is that a good way, a bit of a starter for 10 for comparing themselves? Because obviously it's going to be dependent on each individual provider.
Yes.
The relationship they have with employers, etc.
Yeah, exactly. So that template, that original template there, I think that covers all eventualities. If we spelt all these out here, you'll have a spreadsheet as big as the pre-webinar reading material for each framework and standard. Yep. So that's a way to do it. Yeah. So
so I think the materials are very helpful as a guidance, but of course it's going to be each provider is going to have to look at this on an individual basis, because everyone on the call today and in the provider network will have a different range of programs available, different learner ages, profiles,
definitely,
etc.
And it depends which figures you want to get to. You might only be interested in the total that comes to you, rather than the employer contribution, the government contribution. You might want to know them all, but it does get very complicated. But yeah, that template is meant to set out, okay, these are the possibilities, and if you filled out every single figure in this, you'd have a complete overview of where all the funding is, but you'd have to do that for each framework.
And we've known for quite a while, obviously the writing has been on the wall for frameworks for quite a while through the reform, cemented by the government's 2020 vision. Usually qualifications will expire and a new set of rationale and programs will start sort of the day after. Is this funding changes and putting both standards and frameworks into bands, is it really to do exactly what we think it is, to almost force the issue of moving from frameworks to standards, or is the flexibility in comparing the old and new mean that it's not quite as black and white as that, and people do have a little bit longer to transit depending on their particular sector focuses and businesses?
I think that's a really tricky one, because it's not written anywhere that the funding has been done to force the issue. The official line is they recognise that the standards are more costly to deliver, which you probably know more about than me, Gary, given the endpoint assessment. But I think there is definitely a recognition, and the skills minister himself said this in writing in FE Week, didn't he? That the standards are funded at a higher rate, which is why we're encouraging people to move over to them, which is a bizarre way of looking at it, because I think that's why they're set out like that. Yeah. So I think it is definitely a push. It's not written in black and white, but you can't see it as any other way. I don't think.
Thanks, Sian. I know you're going to give you a chance just to take a breath once again. So I know now you're going to move on to actually delivering apprenticeships, because there are some changes there again, which are intrinsically linked, although not specifically about the pounds and pence, but are very linked, particularly with the involvement in the Skills Funding Agency. So if you could just take us through the new register, and I know that a bit of a hot topic is that it was only announced very recently that there's potential delay to the new register of apprenticeship training providers.
Yes. So I've just put this here just to remind ourselves that the SFA will be changing the way that they work with providers. So first of all, with the levy paying employers, there'll be no SFA procurement and contracting, so they won't work with training providers to work out how many apprenticeships they're taking on and the funding for those. It will all go through the digital apprenticeship service, so it'll all be all about employers having the money in their own accounts and then knocking on the door of training providers. Now, of course, that's only 2% of employers will be paying the levy, but it's a huge amount of money in the levy. For the non-levy paying employers, they'll still be contracting for the SFA for a transition period until at least 2018. And what the SFA want that to happen, the way the SFA want that to happen is a one-off procurement. Then that will move to the digital apprenticeship service, and then everybody will be using that system. Now, on top of that, which is why I've put it in the section, that the Skills Funding Agency don't want to use their existing register when it comes to apprenticeship providers. And the reason for this is they want people delivering apprenticeships to very specifically be approved for apprenticeships, and they want to allow employers to deliver apprenticeships as well. So they've decided to open this very new register, which will be much more accessible to employers. It'll be easier for employers to get on, because there'll be certain elements of it that they won't have to comply with because they're already recognised employers. And when people are registered on it, as in current providers, it will be very much around their apprenticeship provision rather than around other types of provision, such as adult loan funding and adult provision generally. So yes, we've got this new register of apprenticeship training providers, and it will be separate, and anybody who's on Roto at the moment will have to reapply. So there's no automatic transition, which I think why that piece of news is really important, Gary, because everybody's waiting for this to come out, because everybody wants to make sure that they're on the register and able to deliver apprenticeships. So at the moment, what they set out in the original guidance, which was all up for consultation, and the consultation ended on the 5th September, is that there were going to be 3 application routes. And I don't know if anyone else read the guidance. Hopefully a lot of providers out there did and responded to the SFA. There were going to be 3 routes, the main routes, and then 2 sort of additional routes, which were providers adding value to the delivery of apprenticeships, as in you're not the key deliverer, but you're delivering some of the apprenticeship training, and employers who want to train their own employees, called employer providers. And the reason the SFA is so keen to open this is because they know a lot of levy payers will want to deliver their own training. It was meant to open yesterday, and I think everybody was waiting for it, but we found out last week that it's been delayed, and we don't know the date when it will be open yet. But I think it's good news in a way, because the reason for the delay is because they've taken into account the feedback from the consultation. So hopefully some of the more complicated areas around the original proposals, and like I say, people on this call probably did read them, and examples like to be a provider, you had to be delivering over half of the provision. That really wasn't clear about there were certain terms and definitions that just weren't clear about what you were and who you could be defined as. So hopefully they're taking that into account, and that's why that might be the reason for the delays. But as soon as we hear of anything on this, of course we'll let people know, but I'm sure people are all looking out for it themselves anyway.
Thanks, Sian. As I say, I think important to link funding and actions that the agency has taken as well. So you alluded to a number of time scales, and I just wanted to sort of echo Neil's push really for some of our previous content on our webinars around timescales, particularly on the Institute for Apprenticeships, the implementation of the Digital Apprenticeship Service, and the broader reform. And certainly our first webinar covered that in a lot more detail, and our second webinar also covered some of the timelines to support providers and employer providers, if appropriate, in getting ready for delivery of standards, including things like pedagogy as well. So I'll hand over to you and let you go through some of the timelines specifically relating to funding, but I think it's just important just to put that in the broader context of the timelines of reform.
I think that's quite a good something for us to take back actually is to bring all these timelines together from maybe all the presentations and look at those. So rather than the way that they're presented on slides, and just put something together that's a bit more comprehensive. Okay, for funding timelines though, at the moment all the funding that I've taken you through for May 2017 were proposals in a consultation document. So the co-investment rate at 90% is a proposal. The English and Maths payments were proposals, and the technical rules are all proposals. So in October, sometime this month, there should be final funding information published. Now, I don't expect that to change hugely. I think a lot of what we saw were thought through ideas rather than maybe a true consultation. But people have fed back to that, including us. So we should see that all being confirmed in October. In December, sorry, we've got something wrong on that slide. It shouldn't be repeated there in December. What we will see in December, and we'll fix this before we put this slide on the website, is further guidance from HMRC on how to calculate and apply the apprenticeship levy. So we're seeing a lot of rough figures, well, not rough figures, we're seeing a lot of figures on the apprenticeship levy, but there should be more technical detail for those employees that are actually paying, the employers that are actually paying it. In April, of course, the levy kicks in, and then in May 2017, the new funding methodology kicks in. So as soon as those levy payments start coming out from the 1st of May, any student or any apprenticeship that starts after the 1st of May will be funded according to the new funding methodology. So there's a real hard change there. We've also got the transition with the withdrawal of frameworks, and this is why I think a very comprehensive timeline might be useful, just showing people the changes month by month, because of course as we said at the beginning, the funding is all happening within the context of the broader apprenticeship reform, which is the removal of frameworks to standards. In June, 7 frameworks were withdrawn. We had a consultation on further 55 frameworks to withdrawn from April 2017 and July. In September, the list was announced, so we know that more are going to be withdrawn from April. In December, 56 further frameworks were withdrawn, and in April we have 55 extra that are possibly going to be withdrawn, and they're under review. So that you can see that I think you had a percentage, didn't you, Gary, about how many have been switched off already, and then how many. But it's quite a high number that are already been switched off, and it's quite key here, because the first ones that they switched off had very low registrations or no registrations, but now the ones that are under review don't necessarily have low registrations. They do have replacement standards, so they're moving now into territory where they're switching off frameworks that are actually still quite popular. So it's really important to keep an eye on what's going and where you're actually pushed into moving over to a standard if you want to keep delivering that particular area. Lastly, we've got the transition with the digital apprenticeship service. So in January, employers can start creating accounts and familiarising themselves with the digital apprenticeship service. Actually, at the moment, they've allowed about 200 training providers and about 400 employers, and you could be one of them to test the system. And they've also started up a pilot recently to ask people to get involved and to start testing how it works, because of course the digital apprenticeship system is a bit wider than just this payment system that we're talking about. It also lets people find apprenticeships, find employers, find training providers. But I think what the key thing they'll be wanting to test is this kind of money moving system, because it'll be crucial. If you're not involved in the pilot or you haven't been asked, it's probably worth getting in touch with the SFA to see if they'll let you get involved. I'm not quite sure how the invitations have worked, but I'm sure they'll be keen for people to make sure it works before it goes live. From May, all employers are asked to select the apprenticeship framework or standard, choose the training provider or providers. So there will be this system there to help people do all that. But the levy paying employers will use this very specific account, which will be brand new and really important for the DFE to work in terms of how all the money will move through the system. And there's also for levy paying employers, it will be important for them because the system will try and help them see how much they've got in their account, how much they've got to spend, how much they're getting topped up by, when their money will run out. So it'll be a really important tool for levy paying employers to keep an eye on what they're spending how they can spend it, especially for those just paying the levy, because they won't have huge amounts of money and they might want to spend the small amount that they've got. So again, those dates for digital apprenticeship service for all employers using the full functionality, including the money moving, is 2018 earliest and 2020 latest. And I'm sure this is just about making sure that they can scale up how it's used. So those are the key dates for this system that is supporting all this.
So a huge amount of information, Sian, today, and I know we've got a couple of other areas to cover. So we do have a question that's come in, so perhaps you'd like to just share with colleagues on the webinar today where they can find out some more information on everything you've talked about today, and then if it's okay, I'll ask you that question before we hand over to our colleague from Pearson UK. Okay, so like Neil says, these will all be embedded in the slides that you will be able to get off the website. So the proposals for the apprenticeship funding from May, that document takes you through that in detail. The proposals for the new register for apprenticeships and the guide for employers, that's probably not so important to get your head around at the moment, because we're waiting for the changes to come out. That's the whole reason it's been delayed, is maybe the proposals they put there aren't being taken through, but it's interesting to see how they're thinking about it. There's a particular briefing on the levy, because of course the levy is be very particular for those employers paying it. And then there's other bits of information about the new apprenticeship system. It's quite a useful it's about 5 pages information on the apprenticeship levy, which looks at data on how much the levy is going to be spent on certain size and sectors, based on how money is spent at the moment. And for levy payers, an online levy calculator, which employers can use to work out how much they'll have to pay, how much they'll have to spend, and essentially you have to put in some key bits of information. What we've tried to do here is again, and the links will be embedded, is just try to summarise some of those documents, and these are all available on our Pearson Funding News website, and we've put a lot of summary documents on there. If you haven't got time to read a lot of funding information, these just tend to be 4 or 5 page summaries of the key points. And also there's that pre-webinar material there as well, and that's the 3rd one down, comparing proposals for new apprenticeship funding from May 2017, which is a really technical document about how you might go about comparing apprenticeship rates. And if anyone's got any questions, they can always get in touch with me on email about this, because I know it's not something that is easy to talk through to a lot of people at the same time, but if you've got very specific questions that you want us to look at, then just do get in touch with us. And as someone that uses your funding focuses regularly, Sian, I do encourage everyone to look at them, because they do cut down reading those 90-page documents. So, as I said, just before we pass over to our colleague in Pearson UK, we did have a question just coming in around rates, etc., which was, will there be fixed costs for providing training in various occupational areas, so there will almost be a level playing field between providers? I think that's the first question. And then also, will providers be approached to deliver areas that they are seen as specialist in? When it comes to fixed costs, there will be every framework and standard will be in one of those bands, as we spoke about. But the difficulty with that answer is that it's not a fixed cost in the model anymore, because that's the maximum. But the model allows the employer to negotiate. So the employer, at the moment, the model allows the employer to say, okay, then I've got this much to spend. This is the band. The band is, I don't know, £16,000, but I would like you to deliver it for £14,000. So the answer is yes and no, I'm afraid. So there is a fixed band, but it's not necessarily the band that you agree with the employer, because essentially it's the employer that agrees what is actually paid. The second question. Sorry, Sian, we cover that actually on our webinar tomorrow, around some of the new thinking and potential changes to providers and FE colleges' business models when it comes to employer engagement, relating exactly to that. So just log in tomorrow. Gary will give you more information. We'll provide us the approach to deliver areas they're seen as specialist in. Again, it's not an answer. It's not an answer I can give you, I'm afraid, because it could be that an employer's heard of you and they could knock on your door with levy funding. Yes. But it could be that you need to get out there and show them that you're specialist in. If you know that they're paying the levy, and 2, that they want to spend that levy, knock on their door.
or it could be that they're not paying the levy and you're a training provider with a contract from the SFA and you want to knock on their door that way. But I think given that with the levy paying employers, the money is all in their pocket, I'm not sure if they're brilliant employers, maybe they will be researching all this, but I think it's going to be a two-way conversation, I'm afraid, rather than it being them knowing straight away where to go.
Okay, thanks, Sean.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Sian. Just before I go across to our guest for today, I'm going to apologise for my rudeness because I introduced myself, but I totally forgot to ask you who all you were. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to very quickly get a quick poll of who we're talking to here, just for our records so we know who attends these webinars. It's going to come up on your screen now. So firstly, can you just let me know what type of organisation you'll work for? I'm going to share the results of these in just 2 seconds. Okay, thanks very much. So 41% training providers, 34% FE colleges, 21% employers. Thank you very much. So next, who exactly are we talking to? So are you senior management? Are you department head or a program leader? Are you a tutor or an assessor, an administrator or something entirely different? Okay, thanks very much. I'm just going to share those there. So mainly department heads. I suppose the reason for that is obvious, wondering about your departmental budgets, but 30% senior management. Clearly worried about overall cash flow in the organisation. And this is probably a silly question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Are you currently offering apprenticeships at your organisation? Okay, 84% have voted. We're not getting any more in, so I'm going to close that one off there. And that was not quite the split I was expecting. So thank you very much for that, everyone. And I do apologise for not asking those questions at the start. Right, now let's go to our guest for today. 2 seconds while I make this work. Okay, so our guest for the day is joining us from somewhere in Essex. She works out of our Harlow office normally, and her name is Anne Ashworth. Anne, can you hear me?
I certainly can, Neil. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to put Sian on now. So Anne is working with us in our HR team as apprentice program delivery manager, and we just invited her on here today to give you a perspective of what Pearson is doing in response to the levy as an employer who's going to be liable for paying that 0.5% premium on its pay bill from April 2017. So over to you, Sian and Anne.
Okay. Hi, Anne. Nice to talk to you.
Hi, Sian. Thank you.
I wanted to interview you here really because a lot of the work we do, and you might have heard that presentation, is around us as an awarding body trying to understand the levy and the impacts on the training providers and the employers outside. And I thought actually we are an employer paying the levy, and so we might be able to give some of the training providers an insight into how an employer is thinking, and some of the employers an insight into how another employer is thinking about how they're paying the levy, what they're using it for. So I just wanted to ask you a few questions about how Pearson are dealing with paying the levy, spending the levy, the admin of the levy, if that's all right.
Absolutely fine.
Okay. So our first question, I think, is the obvious one, and one that the DFE would probably be interested to hear the answer to, is will Pearson look to invest more in apprenticeships as a result of the levy? Is it encouraging us to spend more?
I would say yes, it is. I mean, we've got an existing programme, and we see this as a fantastic opportunity to widen its application across all of the Pearson UK businesses. We're keen to embrace the new learning and talent opportunities that the levy and the new standards bring. And certainly we're looking at delivering within areas of the business that perhaps have not been involved in our apprenticeships before. And that also gives us the opportunity to align the needs of the business to the emerging standards that are coming out.
Okay. And so has it had an impact on recruitment, and or will it have an impact on recruitment and talent acquisition? Will we be looking at it differently given a focus on apprenticeships?
Well, we're certainly reviewing existing approaches and looking to complement them with the apprenticeship new programme. We're working closely with the designated team to develop a clear plan for this. And certainly we see this as a great opportunity to grow existing talent, but also gives us the potential to bring in a younger workforce, perhaps a broader workforce through apprenticeship roles.
Okay, so it's making us think differently about how we might recruit. So when it comes to the frameworks and the standards that are available, how do we select the appropriate occupations and roles for recruiting apprenticeships, for example?
Well, within HR, sorry, Sian. Within HR,
sorry.
Carry on.
I was just thinking we might cover quite a few roles that are on offer within standards and frameworks.
Well, we've got the existing apprenticeships that we currently offer within the business, and we looked at those first. But then we also did a piece of work prospecting within the business, looking at the need and the changes, and particularly empowering managers to review the new standards and to highlight appropriate standards that they believe would apply in their teams. We're really pleased at the appetite for apprenticeships in new areas, actually. And managers are certainly beginning to understand the responsibilities of the apprenticeship role. We're also building in long-term planning and the changing needs of the business. We're also, as you said, looking at frameworks and standards, so we're very conscious of dual running for a period of time as we move from frameworks to standards, and certainly the development of English, Maths and ICT. And we're still placing a great emphasis on ICT as well as English and Maths.
Oh, okay, that's really interesting. The thing I wanted to ask is that in policy terms, there's been quite a focus on, even though it's not a huge area, on higher apprenticeships, and they've introduced more higher level ones. And I always think this might be quite key for certain employers paying the levy, because they might not have a huge amount of learners at levels 2 and 3, but they could have a lot of graduate, and I presume here there's a lot of graduate learners, but there are a lot of higher apprenticeships. Is that something else we're looking at say, levels?
Yes, it is actually. Historically, I would say that we've very much worked at level 2 and level 3 apprenticeships, but now we've got the opportunity to explore the whole range right up to degree level apprenticeships. And again, it's aligning it to the demands of the business. So even though we might be starting at intermediate advance in the first year, I think we're going to see significant changes as we move into new areas such as finance and legal, where automatically you're looking into a professional alignment with the new standards against the professional qualifications in that area.
Yeah, okay. And I'm going to end it on a less exciting question, because I think all that looking at the development roles available in the company is all the admin around looking at how much levy you're paying in, how much levy is coming in, how you're spending that. How are you finding preparing for that? And is there work going on to prepare for all that kind of back office preparation that needs to be done in order to keep this all going financially? Is that something
Yeah, I mean, it's taking up a lot of thought, I must admit. I think we're probably in a good position because we're already a grant payer with the SFA, but we've got some very good liaison with the finance teams who are building processes to ensure that training provision and standards are going to be closely monitored. The finance team is really well prepared, actually, and they're attending all the external events and liaising with HMRC. And as part of the planning, we're also looking at the broader systems and processes that will need to be adapted and changed so that we can monitor not just DAS element, but also the progress of learners with their learning, the recruitment selection, and the endpoint assessment element of it as well.
Yes, of course. Okay. That's great. Thank you so much for that. I think that'll be really interesting for people to know about how, well, one employer is thinking about approaching spending the levy, and for other employers who are thinking about trying to spend the levy.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Really helpful.
Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you very much, Sian. That's been a very interesting webinar to date. We're going to hang around for a little while to give you the opportunity to ask some questions, which you can do via the chat window on which most of you seem to have found so far. Just before you go, I was wondering if I could trouble you for another set of opinions. So we always like to know how we've done with these events. So I was just wondering, I'm going to ask you 3 questions now. Content, delivery, logistics, on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being utterly dreadful, please don't ever ask me that again, and 5 being absolutely excellent, I'd recommend to everyone I know. How would you rate the content of today's event? Okay, so 76% of you have voted there. I'm going to keep those particular ones private, but it's averaging out at about 4. So on delivery. Okay, and that's settled down now. Sian, you'll be very pleased to know that nobody has given you less than a 3, and half of everyone here gave you a 4. 1/4 gave you a 5, so well done with that. And just finally, logistics, and this is me that you're criticising if you give me a 1 or 2, so please don't hold back. Okay, so that's 74% saying 4. And finally, one further question, would you recommend these to your colleagues? This is the final question, and then we'll wrap up and ask any questions that have come through. Okay, so we've got one more question that has come in, which I'm going to ask to Sian in just a moment. Oh, excellent. 61% have voted, 61% of... Oh, someone's just spoiled it by clicking maybe. It was 100%. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Sian, I'm going to open up your mic again now because we've got a question come in that's that is relevant to you. 2 seconds, I'm going to put you back online. Banding levels must include training and endpoint assessment. Is there anywhere to find out the proportion that is being allocated to the endpoint assessment, i.e. is there going to be a limit on what an endpoint assessment provider can seek to leave sufficient funds for the training?
I don't think that'll be written down anywhere. There's a bit... People are taking it as a tiny bit of a clue that in the guidance, it just says in the guidance for levy payers, but it might be applied to all. 20% of the funding will be held back until the endpoint assessment is delivered. Now, what that is giving people ideas about is 20% of the band the cost of the endpoint assessment. Now, I don't think it's as black and white as that. I don't think it's therefore the EPA is 20%. But the answer to the question is no. That will all be negotiated. So it'll be quite a series of negotiations here, really, because you'll have to negotiate as a training provider, negotiating the price with the employer, and then talking to the endpoint assessment provider. That could be the same one, as to what the endpoint assessment will cost. So in the funding bands, there is nothing to say that this is what the EPA will cost. It will all be about talking to the different EPA providers. And of course, some EPAs will be far more expensive than others. So I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all in terms of the EPA. I think it's one of those things that's going to have to be costed in to the thinking when you're thinking about running each apprenticeship standard, because it could cost 10% for one, 20% for another. It's not a set price. Sorry, that's not particularly solid answer there, but that's all we have.
And one further question has come in: will there be a cap on the number of apprentices per year? We know there's a target. Is there a cap?
God, I think no. Because there'll be a cap in terms of levy payers can spend 100% of their levy. Now, if they want to invest more, they'll use the contribution model. Now, the only way that the government would impose a cap is if there were so many non-levy payers and levy payers spending their levy and then investing and wanting that 90% government investment. So there will be a cap in terms of the non-levy payers in terms of the SFA contracts, as always. But after that, there is no cap on if the levy is spent, the levy is spent. The non-levy will be SFA procurement for now.
I think there's a reality though, Sian, isn't there, that the DfE are perhaps hoping that there won't be a full levy spend out of every pot that will support funding for other employers
so I think,
and apprenticeships as well. So I'm sure they have modelled that, but I don't think they're not expecting that.
No, I think they would be, in theory, overjoyed if every levy payer spent their levy and then started to use the non-levy model where they paid, the government paid the 90%, even though the government would be spending money. It would mean the target would be reached. But yes, I think definitely they know that's not going to happen, and they assume that a lot of the money from the non-levy payers in future years will come from unused levy pots. And there's a lot of this is anecdotal now, but there are employers thinking that they will just write this off as a tax and not invest. And that might change in years to come, because they might think actually there's a pool of money here that we're not using. But no, at the moment there's no notion of a cap outside of the SFA contracts for non-levy payers, because of course that is the maximum they will spend is in the contracts that they give to the providers. But yeah, the levy payers.
We have one come in just around clarification on whether an endpoint assessment organisation has to be different to the training provider. Yes, it does. There has to be an element of independence. There are two different registers. The Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers, albeit delayed, that Sian has talked about, and there's also the Register of Apprenticeship Assessment Organisations as well. The current guidance that is valid, December 2015, states that has to be entirely independent. Anecdotally, we are seeing that softening somewhat from the DfE in terms of the interpretation of independence. I don't expect that to be in blood/writing until the formation of the Institute for Apprenticeships in April next year. But we are seeing a softening of that, whereby a provider, a college, or another type of organisation, alongside awarding organisations, will be able to provide some elements of endpoint assessment, as long as that independence is absolutely clear as well. And there are also some standards, such as customer service, which are now going to be externally quality assured by Ofqual, and that also puts a slightly different spin on it that we don't have time for, unfortunately, today. but does mean that certain endpoint assessment organisations where Ofqual is involved will actually have to meet awarding body regulations as well. So the answer is it's not quite as black and white. I sound a bit like Sian now. Not quite as black and white as it used to be. Unfortunately, the black and whiteness is still live. We are expecting there to be some further softening around that.
Thanks, Gary.
Okay, we have had a few more questions come in. So I'm just going to ask one of the more interesting ones, and then I think as we're starting to see people drop out and we're already 15 minutes over time, I will probably close it up there, but we will make sure that your question is answered, and I will explain to you how you can get the answer to that question in just a moment. So final question for today, and this is a general one for both Gary and for Sian. Are we expecting to see issues of capacity in the sector to meet the increased demand from employers once the levy kicks in? Predictions. Gary first. Thanks, Neil. Oh, 2 seconds. I need to unmute you first. I suppose that would help, wouldn't it? Gary.
My colleagues in the room will know that I can usually have two hats on, a professional view and a Gary view. I'll start with the Gary view. I think there will be, certainly at the beginning, some capacity constraints. My professional hat and voice would say it's all about everything we've talked about today and in the previous webinars. It's about getting ready for the transition, getting ready to teach, getting ready to build that capacity, change your business models potentially to meet the new emerging and changing requirements of employers. Will it be a smooth transition? Any transition from, I'm not sure whether the apprenticeship reform is necessarily revolutionary, but it's certainly an evolution. Yes, there will be pain points. Yes, there will be capacity issues. Some of those will be, can only be sorted, I believe, by the department, by the IFA, although the IFA seems to be the answer to everything at the moment. And I think there's still more work policy-wise to do from the DfE angle. So sorry, a complete ramble there. Yes, there will be some constraints. Can I predict where they will be? No, because policy will change very much from now up until April and May, and that may solve some of those potential conflicts. It may not. Sian.
I don't have much more to add to that, apart from to say that given the push on the policy and the push on the funding, I think if the money is there and as long as it can pay for what it intends to cover, then people will be keen to get involved and make it work. That's just a funding answer, really. But I completely agree with your kind of it will be a difficult journey.
You asked a very cynical person that question, Neil. Thank you.
I knew I'd get some detailed answers if I asked that. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today. You took a while to warm up and get engaged, but it seems as though that's because you were absolutely fascinated by the content, judging by the feedback scores that we've been getting. So thank you very much for your participation. There were some questions we couldn't answer today, but keep in touch with us through any of these channels, and answers will be forthcoming. So you can follow us on Twitter, currently at BTEC Apprentice, although we're about to update the name of that profile. Also on LinkedIn, when you get a hold of the slides, you can find a link through to our company profile on LinkedIn there. The Insight newsletter, which goes out every month, and that's our updates for all things work-based learning and apprenticeships, once per month, summing up everything that's going on in the sector and with Pearson. Sian Owen also has her own funding-focused newsletter, which if you haven't found it yet, I will make sure that that's in the follow-up email that goes out after this one. It's generally a lifesaver if, like me, you're a bit of a novice where funding is concerned. And Sian has also passed me a note saying you can ask direct questions to funding@pearson.com. Nice and simple, nice and straightforward. I think one of the places where we might find the answers to some of the questions we couldn't ask today is on our Insight blog, on the Pearson UK website. and some of the answers to some of the questions that Gary didn't want to answer today are going to be in one of our, in fact, our only remaining scheduled Insight webinar, which is due to run tomorrow at 4 p.m. That's going to feature James Emmett, our stakeholder, our Director of Strategic Partnerships, and I'm very happy to say we're going to have guests from the AOC, David Cork, Director of Education and Skills Policy, and from Birmingham Metropolitan College, we're pleased to be joined by Mike Townsend, who's going to give the benefit of his experience about actually implementing new standards. So very much looking forward to that one. Future events to be announced. We're going to send out a survey shortly asking for your views on what we should be covering that perhaps we haven't got anywhere near during this series yet. So please keep an eye out for that and let us know what you'd like to hear about. So you can find more at any time, quals.pearson.com/apprenticeships. That's our main site. That page is going to be upgraded shortly, make it easier to find the information that you need. But for now, for this evening, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I bid you good nights.